Today's story might sound like something straight out of Hollywood because, well, it is. Imagine for a second that you're a freelance photographer, and then one day, out of the blue, you get a call from someone named Amy Pascal. A quick Google search shows her arm in arm with Angelina Jolie and Denzel Washington and Tom Holland. She is a former chair at Sony Pictures Entertainment and a major Hollywood producer. And she wants you to fly to Indonesia to scout locations for her new Netflix show. This could be your big break. So 6 days after your first email with Amy, you're on a plane to Jakarta. When a driver meets you at the airport, Amy tells you to pay him and keep track of your expenses. The two of you spend hours on the phone going over the project. And then one day, you realize that you have burned through your savings. You're in a foreign country, and Amy and her promise to reimburse you never materializes. On the surface, this sounds like a textbook con. But as the Hollywood Reporter's Scott Johnson reveals in his new book and documentary, Hollywood Con Queen, this scam was different. It wasn't really about the money. It was about something deeper. To talk about all of this, Scott Johnson joins me on Crime Story. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So you spent years reporting on this scam. Can you walk me through how it worked?
The scammer worked by impersonating very famous, very powerful women like Amy Pascal, like Kathleen Kennedy, like the Marvel executive Victoria Alonso. Name a huge blockbuster movie, and the chances are one of these women had something to do with it. As I say in the book, they were the people who shaped the cultural appetites of people around the world. So you can't, They were immensely influential and powerful. And so this impersonator essentially stole their identities and in the guise of these women targeted that huge class of victims that ranged from cinematographers to actors to veterans who worked as security personnel. And if you can imagine yourself as an artistic creative of some sort, let's say a photographer, an actor, a screenwriter, and one day you get a call from a Hollywood producer who dangles before you an opportunity that in some ways seems too good to be true. Travel to Indonesia, work on this fascinating project, you sign on, off you go. Once you're in Indonesia, you start forking over money for the fees associated with the work that you've been asked to do. So that would be, a few $100s for a car, a few hundred more for some photography permits, and so on. So the costs start to mount. And then one day, the whole thing falls apart. You figure out that it's all made up and that you've essentially been lured to a country that you've never been to, and you've been ensnared in this fantasy for weeks on end, and your whole world comes crumbling down. At last count, there were hundreds of these people. They hailed from every continent on the planet, with the exception of Antarctica, of course. That's what happened to them.
So how did the scammer make it so convincing to people?
The victims would be bombarded with this immense, fantastical story about the opportunity that they were going to pursue. And then the sales pitch was bolstered by a flurry of documentation in the form of emails, non-disclosure agreements, contracts, like lengthy 20-page contracts, and then followed up by multiple phone calls, that would last for an hour, 2 hours, going over all the minutia of the upcoming trip and so forth. So when you start to grapple with all that information, you realize what an absolutely huge amount of work was required just to keep people on the hook and then convince them that this was a worthwhile use of their time and that they should, in fact, go to the airport, get on a plane, and fly halfway around the world to a country that most of them had never been to. So the persuasive element was huge, which then begs the question, well, for what? There was not a lot of money involved for a lot of these victims. Some of them, yes, lost a huge amount of money, but most of them did not. I mean, it was on the order of a few thousand, And so why? And we can get into that. But the scale of the scam is really to be understood best in the amount of work it took and the number of victims and impersonated people who were brought in, which, that number I think just continues to grow even as we speak.
Can you talk to me about how you started to click in that it was a scam? We'll talk about who was doing it, but I'm curious to know, when did the idea that these people who are being sent all over the world and spending their own money with the promise of it being obviously returned and a high paycheck realize that that wasn't true?
Well, it kind of varied. There were some people who cottoned on right away, but other people got swept up in these really elaborate fantasies, and it took them, in some cases, several months to figure it out, and they wound up losing tens of thousands of dollars. In a few cases, there were over $100,000. And there was one story in particular that stuck with me where an entire family got caught up. There was a screenwriter, his two sisters, his mother, his grandmother, all of them in some way got caught up, and all of them were sort of blindsided and just completely bewitched by the whole thing. So it really depended on the victim as to how long they stayed.
How long it took them.
Yeah, how long it took them.
Yeah, my husband and I watched the documentary, and my husband's in film and TV. He's an art director and a production designer. And, especially during COVID, it was really clear to me how easy it would have been to get caught up in that. Can you explain a little bit about the world of people who have to survive? He's always contract. It was so volatile. Even now we're seeing things sort of not even come back from the strike. It's always sort of feels like it's glamorous to say you work in that world, but it's tough. And so they were kind of the perfect victim in some way.
Absolutely. And this is kind of an interesting point, because I think for a lot of people who don't work in that, I don't know what you call it, maybe a gig economy or sort of the world of the creative industries, they don't maybe understand this, but that is how that industry works. People are freelancers. They get a call often at the last minute. They're expected to foot the bill for their trip. This is how journalists work. Off they go. They pay for the airfare. They pay for the hotels with the expectation that on the back end, once they've delivered their product, they will be compensated. So you're right. It was an optimal victim class, because on the one hand, there were people used to the economics of that model, and on the other hand, they were dreamers. These were people who were chasing the big break in Hollywood. And one of the more sad aspects of the scam is that it preyed on that class of people. It preyed on their dreams.
There is also a very uncomfortable conversation with one of the young men who is sexually manipulated by this person. You did a really nice job of showing just how deep he was into it and how manipulated he got by the whole thing, still thinking he was speaking to this high-powered Hollywood executive.
Yeah, so this was an element of the scam that emerged after I had been reporting on it for a while. I started to meet these guys, and they were almost exclusively men, at least the ones that I met, who they had been contacted by a powerful female executive. In some cases, it got very sexual, but even more disturbing, perhaps, I think, than that is that in many cases, these men found themselves in a kind of relationship with the women, and they would spend hours on the phone just talking, getting deeper and deeper into these emotional entanglements with this fictional person.
You are such a kind soul, and more importantly, such a responsible man. You know that you're so gentle and super beautiful. And I'm sure you're going to make this an amazing experience. Yep. Give me a kiss.
And so, again, you sort of wonder, well, to what end? I mean, there was nothing financial to be had. It was purely a psychological manipulation. And it was quite sad because for a lot of these guys, they were security contractors, who had spent years working in war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Very often their family lives were distressed. They came back, they were looking for a big break. The big break never occurred. And then to top it all off, they found themselves entangled in these really kind of tragic, sad, fake relationships with these women. And then it would all come apart, and it's less sexual and more intimate, and in a way that's even more devastating.
Deeper.
Yeah. And so that was really quite shocking to have to contend with.
Let's get to uncovering who this was. Surprisingly, it was a man impersonating these women. Tell me how you figured out who it was.
So the documentary follows my investigation of the story, and it also follows the investigation of a woman named Nicole Katsianis, who was a private investigator who was hired by a lot of these.
Amazing.
Yeah, she is amazing. And she was hired.
I love her.
Yeah. Yeah, she's great. And she was hired by a lot of these impersonated women to figure out what the heck was going on. And in the beginning, she didn't know if it was a criminal gang, a group, a mafia, a group harvesting bodies and organs. And so Nicole put in a lot of really impressive investigative legwork to figure out who the scammer was, because she'd been working on it for at least a year before I came along. In my case, it was a lot more straightforward. I wrote this story. It was a cover story in The Hollywood Reporter in 2018. Well, I was immediately inundated with all kinds of tips, people who thought they knew who it was, and I chased all of them down. They all turned out to be wrong. And then one day, I got a message from a guy who said, look, I want to be anonymous, but I know who this is. Let's talk. And it turned out that this guy was a very well-known film director in Indonesia. And as we're talking, he's sending me through pictures, documents, articles, chat, like all this evidence. And not only that, but he's spoken to this person.
So who was it?
Yeah, so it turned out that it was not a mafia group, not an organ harvesting organization, or even a group of any kind. It was just this one man. He was like a 40-year-old Indonesian guy of Indian extraction. He had spent years in prison prior to this scam ever taking place on terrorism-related charges. He had engineered a number of other scams in Indonesia targeting the creative community there before moving on to Hollywood. He was a master of accents. He was exceptionally intelligent and persuasive, very eccentric. And by the time I found out about it, he was living in London, and he was making a go as a food influencer on Instagram.
What's his name?
His name was Hargobind Tahil Ramani.
I want to ask you about the terrorism charges, because I think that's important to understand that too. But you do go back to his early days, speaking to his sister and going back to his childhood town. Like, what did you find out? He had a pretty rough beginning.
Yeah, so he was born in Indonesia in 1979 on Halloween. He was a pretty troubled kid. He suffered from nightmares. From a very early age, he displayed a talent for mimicry and voice work. He was really interested in movies, and according to him, that's thanks to his father, who was a film aficionado. He went to a private school for the Indian community in Jakarta. It was very conservative, pretty insular community. And according to him, he felt quite stifled. He was gay, and he claimed that was very difficult for him.
To the point of being sent to a conversion camp, right? At some point in his life.
So basically, yeah. So his mother died when he was a teenager. Even before then, though, he had already started to show real signs of antisocial behavior. This is according to people who knew him. He started on a series of kind of low-level scams targeting friends, family, and then expanding steadily outward to target people in the larger community. And there were a number of lawsuits that arose as a result of his employment. So there was a lot of trouble. Eventually, he wound up in a psychiatric institution, and then he was let go, or he escaped, depending on who you ask. And then at a later point, he wound up in another institution. This one was less kind of clinical in nature and more explicitly religious in nature. And there he claimed, and I later confirmed, that some residents were subjected to gay conversion therapy. Sort of mixed accounts on whether or how much he was, subjected to that particular kind of therapy. He claimed he was. In conversations that I had with the folks at that place, sometimes they said he was. In other instances, they said he wasn't. So it's hard to know. But certainly they did do it there for sure. And he claimed that he was essentially tortured, and that the treatment that he was subjected to, scarred him for life.
And I want to go back to those terrorism charges that you mentioned. What was that all about?
When he's having real trouble with his family and friends, and he's doing all these petty scams, at a certain point, it got so bad that he was charged and convicted on embezzlement. And he went to this big sprawling penitentiary in Jakarta called Cipinang, which is really where they send the most hardened criminals. I mean, it's filled with terrorists who, had been swept up in the various operations that the Indonesian police and security services had conducted after that country had been ravaged by terrorist attacks. And he's in there, and he conducts some more scams while he's in there. And then after a while, maybe after about a year or so, the U.S. Embassy gets a call, and it's a bomb threat. And it's followed by another one. And there were a number of these calls. Obviously, the U.S. Embassy takes it very seriously. They track the call to the prison, and they determine that the calls came from this specific individual, and it was Harvey, as we call him. That's what he's known by. Hargobind is Harvey. And they try him on terrorism-related charges, and he's convicted and ordered to stay in Cipinang for 3 additional years.
Wow.
And that's more or less when the iteration of the scam that we now know as the Hollywood Con Queen scam begins to manifest.
And eventually you track him down. He's in the UK. He's this Instagram guy.
Right.
You do meet him there. He doesn't talk to you then, but he agrees to speak to you. And eventually, once you're home, you guys start to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the documentary, they do a great job of showing it. I mean, talk to me a little bit about what it was like to communicate with him.
Yeah. Oh, man. I laugh, but it was, it was really intense. You can
only laugh, right?
Yeah. Now.
What else can you do? Yeah.
Well, as you say, he didn't want to talk to me. I had tracked him down. I'd gone to Manchester, where he was living, and approached him on the street and had a conversation with him. We spoke for maybe 30 minutes or so on the street, but he didn't want to take it any further. And then he said, "I promise you, I will talk to you. I'll tell you everything you want to know, but we have to do it by Zoom when you've left the UK." So a few days later, I left the UK. The day I left, actually, the UK went into full lockdown. And so I just barely managed to get in and out before the whole thing would have become impossible. So I get out, I go back to the US, and he started talking, and he would not stop. I mean, he called all the time. He would call every day at about 8 a.m. my time. And I have a family. And so I would have to basically,
I was gonna ask you,
yeah, I would have to.
how was your marriage after that? Yeah.
Well, my wife is an angel, and just absolutely, I owe everything to her. She has the hugely patient and tolerant person, and very immensely supportive. And so basically, whenever the phone rang, I would always know it was him because it would pop up on the screen as no caller ID. And as soon as I saw that, I would just say to her, wherever we were, I'd say, "Oh, it's him." And she'd say, "Okay, bye." And I would go upstairs, shut the door, and I would be up there for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time. And that was just the initial call. And then throughout the rest of the day, which was his night, more calls would come in. I'd be at the grocery store, I'd be in the car, I'd be with my kids, I'd be just living my life or trying to live my life. And he would call. I mean, sometimes he would be ingratiating and charming and lovely and sort of full of humor and wit.
Oh, I love Disney animations. Aladdin, I love the most because, in my nose and the way I love to consider myself Aladdin. And although I had a crush on Aladdin.
And other times he would fly into these absolute rages and just howl at me or the world or whoever the perceived enemy of the day was.
But I know they want revenge. They want to hit me with all these allegations. They're allowed to. And I'm not allowed to defend myself. I could get my story out.
And then everything in between. Sometimes he would cry. At times those tears seemed real and authentic, and at times they felt much more like crocodile tears. It was hard to know.
Deborah Snyder and Amy Pascal and Kathleen Kennedy are women I looked up to all my life. I'm in shock that all that happened. Completely utter shock.
He would talk about movies and producers he loved. He would talk about the victims. He would mention them by name. He talked about me and my family. I mean, he just went on and on and on. And, I think people listening might say, well, why did you keep listening to him? And I think it's a legitimate question. But for me, wanted to obviously understand the scam. And so I asked repeatedly about that. But I also wanted to understand what his mind looked like. And he obliged me in that regard. He told me so many amazing stories about trips he had taken, about what his family life had been like, about what it was like growing up in Indonesia at the time, about his feelings. I mean, he just poured himself out to me. And the question then became for me, well, how much of this is true? How much is a lie? How much of this is just sheer storytelling where the distinction between truth and fiction is completely lost and in fact doesn't even matter anymore because this person is just so carried away by the act of storytelling. And I found that really interesting, trying to figure out what it all meant and where I fit into it. And so, it was overwhelming, totally overwhelming, but ultimately it was kind of rewarding in a way too.
As a viewer, it felt overwhelming to watch it. And so I can't even imagine. I mean, obviously nothing of what you went through is on the screen, but it was overwhelming. What conclusions did you come to about why he did it?
Well, I'll just preface this by saying I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's complicated. I mean, probably there were reasons having to do with a certain pleasure he took in inflicting pain on other people and placing other people in really impossible, devious, manipulative, and deceitful situations and sort of watching them suffer. I saw enough examples of that. But I also think there is something kind of unique to him that has more to do with perhaps a sense of stifled dreams and a childhood longing to be part of Hollywood, to be loved and adored by people, to be an artist of some sort. And so in a way, it's no surprise that he targeted people who were striving for the very same thing. in an industry that had kind of rejected him because he did spend some time in Hollywood when he was a student, and it didn't work for him. So all these years later, that sense of failure perhaps haunted him.
Did he ever explain himself to you about why? Other than you understanding why, did he ever try to explain himself?
Well, the closest he came was at one point he was talking about the victims, and he expressed basically a great deal of contempt for them. Told me that these were people who got what they deserved. I mean, he rationalized away his behavior by saying that these people wanted to be famous. They wanted to go on this trip. They would have done anything to make it. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but I think for the victims, he rationalized it that way. And in another conversation, he talked about how enamored and in love with the idea of basically being an actor, being able to inhabit another person's voice and body and being able to express himself in that particular artistic way. And it was something about the way he said it, and I kind of believed him. And I say that fully aware that he was somebody who lied constantly about all kinds of things. But I think in that case, it felt kind of real. So that's the most generous interpretation I think I can come up with. But this is somebody who did this for years and years and years to hundreds of people and had absolutely no remorse about it. So when I'm thinking about this, I try to kind of hold both of those things together. You know, this knowledge that he really enjoyed sort of torturing people this way, and at the same time, probably somewhere buried deep within him had a legitimate desire to inhabit a world that he just was never able to inhabit.
So when did the calls with Harvey end?
Well,
for you?
It was the day before Thanksgiving 2020, and we had signed off that night fairly late. I remember he told me I needed to spend time with my family. Thanksgiving was coming up. He said family's important. And he said, I'll call you tomorrow. And then I never heard from him again. And I learned the next day that he had been arrested and was being held in police custody as a wanted figure. So the police in the UK had him on their radar for some time at the request of the FBI. And then I reached out in the weeks and months that followed to his court-appointed attorney in an effort to see if he would talk to me again. And he declined, and I haven't heard from him since.
And where is he now? Is he still in prison? Was he found guilty?
So in June of last year, actually on the day the book came out, the judge in his extradition case ruled that he should be extradited to the United States to face 8 federal charges ranging from, identity theft to wire fraud and a bunch of other charges. And then he set about very quickly appealing that decision, and that's where we are today. The case is still on appeal. He's been in prison for close to, 3.5 years now. He may get extradited on appeal. Judge may rule that he's done time served and he might get out. If he does get extradited, he might cop a plea, or he might try to fight it in court. So we'll see what happens.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things that you kind of worked on was your place in all of this. I mean, you spent so long on this story. I'm sure it still lives with you somewhat. Did you ever figure that out?
You know, I have never in my life as a journalist ever had this kind of an interaction with the subject, this intense, this prolonged, one that sort of took me to such strange places, both geographically, but also just emotionally and kind of ethically, morally. But I don't know. I think my role is just what I told him it would be from the outset, which is that I wanted to understand what had happened and who he was and why he had done what he'd done and where he came from and and what it said about all of us and about human nature. And I was very clear with him that I was not his advocate. I was not his ally, nor was I his friend, but I was somebody who wanted to hear what he had to say with an open mind as best I could, because that was really ultimately the only thing I could do. So that was really my role, was just to do what I could do to tell that story.
Well, you tell it well, and your thoughtfulness comes through. So thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for your work. I can't wait to find out what you do next.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We release a new episode every Monday, so please remember to follow the show in your podcast app. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcasts YouTube channel or by subscribing to CBC Podcasts' True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Sarah Clayton. Sound design by Graham McDonald. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. And our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.